year 591 AD, Pope Gregory I delivered a sermon. In that sermon, he made a statement about a woman named Mary Magdalene. He said she was a prostitute. He had no evidence for this claim. The canonical Gospels contain no such description. No historical document from the 1st century supports it. No credible source connects Mary Magdalene to prostitution in any form. Pope Gregory simply stated it. From the most powerful religious pulpit in the Western world, and because he was the Pope, because his words carried the authority of the institution that controlled education, literacy, and the interpretation of Scripture across an entire civilization, the world believed him for 14 centuries. It took the Catholic Church until 1969, 1378 years later, to officially correct this misidentification. 1378 years of the most important woman in the New Testament being remembered as something she never was. That correction came quietly, without a major announcement, without the kind of public acknowledgement that the original claim had received, and most people never heard about it. Tonight we correct the record, completely. Let's start with what the canonical Gospels actually say about Mary Magdalene. Not what tradition says, not what centuries of art and theology say. The texts themselves. Mary Magdalene appears in all 4 canonical Gospels. She is mentioned by name at least 12 times in the New Testament, more than most of the 12 apostles. And what the texts say about her is remarkable. Luke 8:2 identifies her as one of a group of women who traveled with Jesus and his disciples, and who supported the ministry financially out of their own resources. The text describes her as someone from whom Jesus had cast out 7 demons. This is the verse that Pope Gregory later used to construct his prostitute narrative, claiming that the 7 demons represented the 7 deadly sins, including lust. But the text itself says nothing of the kind. Demon possession in 1st century Jewish context was understood as illness, physical or psychological suffering. It was not a moral category. Mary Magdalene was wealthy enough to support a traveling ministry. She was trusted enough to travel with Jesus and his inner circle. She was present at the crucifixion when most of the male disciples had fled. And she was the first witness to the resurrection. This last point cannot be overstated. In all 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Mary Magdalene is the first person to see the risen Jesus. She is the first to receive the news. She is the one sent to tell the others. In the theological language of the early church, the person sent to announce the resurrection was called an apostle, from the Greek apostolos, meaning one who is sent. Mary Magdalene was, by the logic of the texts themselves, the first apostle. The apostle to the apostles, the phrase used by several early church fathers to describe her. That is the woman Pope Gregory called a prostitute. To understand how the misidentification happened, we need to understand the specific act of textual confusion that made it possible. In the Gospel of Luke chapter 7, there is a story about an unnamed woman, described as a sinner, who washes Jesus' feet with her tears and anoints them with expensive perfume. She is not named, she is not identified as Mary Magdalene. She is simply a woman in the city who was a sinner. In the Gospel of John, chapters 11 and 12, there is a woman named Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, who also anoints Jesus' feet with expensive perfume. Mary Magdalene is introduced in the very next chapter of Luke, chapter 8, as an entirely different person, with no connection to the unnamed sinner of chapter 7. 3 different women, 3 different stories. Pope Gregory collapsed all 3 into one. The unnamed sinner of Luke 7, the Mary of Bethany of John 11 and 12, and Mary Magdalene of Luke 8. He declared them all to be the same person. And since the unnamed sinner was described as a woman of the city, which Gregory interpreted as a prostitute, Mary Magdalene inherited that label. This was not a misreading born of ignorance. Gregory was one of the most educated men in the world. He had access to the texts. He could read them in Greek and Latin. This was a choice. Eastern Christianity, the Orthodox Church, never accepted Gregory's identification. The Eastern Church has always maintained that Mary Magdalene, Mary of Bethany, and the unnamed sinner are three separate women. Only Western Christianity adopted Gregory's conflation. And only Western Christianity has spent 14 centuries remembering its most important female witness as a prostitute. The canonical Gospels are not the only ancient texts that mention Mary Magdalene. In 1945, among the Nag Hammadi manuscripts discovered in Egypt were several texts that mentioned her in ways that the canonical tradition had suppressed. The Gospel of Philip, a Gnostic text dated to the 2nd or 3rd century, contains one of the most debated passages in all of early Christian literature. It describes Mary Magdalene as Jesus's companion. The Greek word used is koinonos, which in context suggests a close, intimate relationship, and states that Jesus loved her more than the other disciples and used to kiss her often. The text is fragmentary. There are gaps in the manuscript. The word that follows kiss her in the most crucial sentence is missing. The physical location of the kiss is lost to time and damage. This passage has been interpreted in every possible way as evidence of a romantic relationship, as metaphorical language for spiritual intimacy, as a description of a teaching practice, the kiss of peace used in early Christian communities. What it unambiguously shows is that in at least one strand of early Christian tradition, Mary Magdalene occupied a position of unique intimacy and authority in relation to Jesus, a position that made other disciples, specifically Peter, uncomfortable. The Gospel of Mary, discovered in Egypt in the 19th century, takes this further. In this text, after the resurrection, Mary shares a vision she received directly from Jesus, teachings about the nature of the soul that he shared with her alone. Peter challenges her. He refuses to believe that Jesus would share such teachings with a woman. Levi defends her. If Jesus loved her more than the rest of them, who are they to reject her? This text preserves what appears to be a real historical conflict, a struggle in the early church over the authority of women, a struggle that was resolved in a specific direction, in favor of Peter and male authority, and that required, in order to be maintained, the systematic diminishment of the woman who had been the primary rival to that authority. Mary Magdalene was not diminished because she was unimportant. She was diminished because she was too important. In 2009, construction workers near the town of Magdala, on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, uncovered something unexpected beneath the ground. An ancient synagogue dating to the 1st century AD, one of only 7 1st-century synagogues ever discovered in Israel, and located in Magdala, the ancient name of which was Magdala, the town that gave Mary Magdalene her name. Inside the synagogue, archaeologists found something extraordinary. A large decorated stone, now called the Magdala stone, covered in carvings that include a 7-branched menorah, one of the oldest depictions of the temple menorah ever discovered. This was a significant synagogue, in a significant town, the town where Mary Magdalene grew up. What does this tell us about her? A woman of means, wealthy enough to support a traveling ministry financially, from a significant town with a significant synagogue, not a marginal figure, not a woman from the edges of society, a woman from the Jewish educated class, from a community connected to the temple, from a background that would have given her the religious literacy to understand and transmit the teachings she received. The Archaeology of Magdala gives us a context for Mary Magdalene that is radically different from the prostitute of medieval legend. It gives us a woman of substance, of resources, of religious seriousness, a woman, in other words, entirely consistent with the role the texts actually assign her. Here is one of the great ironies of the Mary Magdalene story. Despite, or perhaps because of, the official church's campaign to reduce her to a repentant prostitute, medieval popular devotion to Mary Magdalene was extraordinary. She became one of the most widely venerated saints in the medieval West, Churches were dedicated to her across Europe. Pilgrimage routes led to shrines claiming to possess her relics. In southern France, a tradition emerged claiming that after the crucifixion, Mary Magdalene, Martha, Lazarus, and other early followers of Jesus had fled to Provence by boat, landing at a place now called Saintes Maries de la Mar, and that Mary Magdalene had spent the last 30 years of her life in a cave in the hills near Saint-Maximin-le-Saint-Baume, where her relics were venerated. This tradition is historically unverifiable. It cannot be confirmed. But it tells us something important about what ordinary medieval Christians intuited about Mary Magdalene, despite what they were officially told. They sensed that she mattered, that she was central, that the official story, the repentant prostitute, redeemed and forgiven, was not the whole story, that there was something larger here, something the official tradition was not fully telling them. They were right. They just didn't have access to the texts that would have told them why. In the second half of the 20th century, biblical scholarship underwent a significant reassessment of Mary Magdalene, driven partly by the discovery of the Nag Hammadi texts, partly by feminist biblical scholarship, partly by the growing accessibility of historical critical methods to a wider academic audience. Scholars began to systematically dismantle the prostitute narrative and reconstruct who Mary Magdalene actually was in the historical record. The conclusions of this reassessment, which now represent the mainstream of academic biblical scholarship, are clear. Mary Magdalene was not a prostitute. There is no evidence for this in any first-century source. The identification was a 6th century invention with political motivations. Mary Magdalene was a woman of independent means who played a significant leadership role in the early Jesus movement. Her financial support of the ministry suggests social status and economic independence unusual for women of her time. Mary Magdalene was the primary witness to the resurrection in all 4 canonical Gospels. In the earliest Gospel, Mark, she is the only named witness at the empty tomb in the original text. Mary Magdalene occupied a position of spiritual authority in at least some strands of early Christianity that rivaled, and in some traditions exceeded, that of Peter. The systematic diminishment of Mary Magdalene was not a natural development of the tradition. It was a deliberate act with a clear purpose: to consolidate male authority in a movement that had, in its earliest form, been significantly more egalitarian. This is now the consensus of academic scholarship. It is not yet the consensus of popular culture. Here is the question that all of this history forces us to ask. If Mary Magdalene was who the texts say she was, the primary witness to the resurrection, a leader in the early church, the woman Jesus trusted above all others with his most important teachings, what does it mean that she was systematically transformed into a penitent prostitute? It means that an institution, the most powerful institution in the Western world for over 1,000 years, deliberately and knowingly altered the historical record to serve its own organizational interests. The interests in question were specific: the exclusion of women from positions of authority in the church, an exclusion that required the erasure of the most prominent female figure in the founding narrative of Christianity. You cannot exclude women from leadership while simultaneously acknowledging that the first apostle, the first person sent to announce the resurrection, was a woman. The solution was not theological argument. The solution was character assassination. Turn the witness into a sinner. Turn the apostle into a penitent. Turn the leader into a cautionary tale. And then, when you have done that, point to the result and say, "You see, women are not suited for spiritual authority." Look at the example of Mary Magdalene herself. That is what happened. Not as a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. Not a meeting in a dark room where men decided to destroy a woman's reputation. But as the slow, institutional accumulation of decisions made by men in power to preserve the power of men. 1,378 years of consequences. Mary Magdalene stood at the cross when the male disciples had fled. She was there at the burial, She was the first to arrive at the tomb on the morning of the resurrection. She was the first to see, the first to know, the first to be sent, the first apostle. Whatever one believes about the theological significance of the resurrection, whether one reads it as literal history, as spiritual truth, as myth, as metaphor, the texts are clear about who was there. Mary Magdalene was there. She was there at the worst moment and the most significant moment in the story that changed the world. And for 14 centuries, the institution built on that story called her a prostitute. She was not. She was a witness, perhaps the most important witness in human history, and her testimony, preserved in fragments, in suppressed texts, in the stubborn popular devotion that refused to let her disappear entirely, is still being heard. 2,000 years later, louder, perhaps, than it has ever been. Holy lore, the stories you were told were only the beginning. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Every week we go deeper into the history that the official version forgot to finish.